So hello, my name is Don Goodman-Wilson. I want to talk about open source today, and a lot of us obviously have a lot of experience consuming open source. But today I want to talk about the way that we produce open source and the implications for us in developer relations, often leading the charge in producing this open source or these open source projects. First, a little bit about me. Who am I? As I said, my name is Don. I'm an ethical tech activist. I'm very interested in what ethical technology looks like, in particular, ethical open source. I'm the director of Katsudon.tech, which is my developer relations consultancy. I help startups form developer relations strategies to get started on the right foot, doing developer relations. I'm a board member of the Maintainerati Foundation, which is a foundation dedicated to understanding the challenges that open source maintainers face and finding best practices for overcoming those challenges. And I'm an active member of the Ethical Source Working Group, which we're going to talk about some today, where we look at how to make open source a much better place for everybody. I also have experience in developer relations in Silicon Valley. It's companies you may have heard of, like Slack and GitHub. But now I'm independent with my own consultancy. And I want to preface everything that I'm going to say in this talk that, as you can tell by my accent, I'm American. And I'm going to give an American and European perspective on this topic. I'm very interested in learning more about how open source projects run in Asia, in China, in Japan, in Korea, in Singapore, and learning more about the specific challenges that open source maintainers face there. Nevertheless, I hope that the insights that I present here will be helpful. So here's what we're going to do in this talk in the remaining time that we have. I want to take you through the narrative arc here. So your community engages when they derive value from your open source software program. It goes without saying, we're in developer relations. We really have a good understanding, I think, of how communities work, when communities engage, and why we even want community in the first place. And I think it goes without saying that we have to provide value to that community for that community to even exist in the first place, never mind thrive. But when we're building open source software, we frequently think about licenses. Licenses are there to make other businesses happy. Licenses are a form of business contract that serve to de-risk business transactions. But making other businesses happy doesn't bring value to our community. Nevertheless, open source licenses are typically the very first thing we think about when we start building open source programs. And sometimes it's the only thing that we give any real thought to. So instead, I want us to focus on bringing value to the community first and not worry so much about the licensing. So this whole talk was inspired by a Twitter interaction not too long ago, back in May, when Default, which is a game engine, open sourced their game engine and announced it on Twitter. So they say they're immensely proud to announce that King Games, the parent company of Default, has released the Default game engine as open source on GitHub and transferred it to the Default Foundation. Now, the license that they released this game under is not on the list of OSI approved licenses, and we'll talk about what that means in a moment. And so the response was loud and vociferous. This is not open source by the standard OSI definition. This is just making the source code available. Oh, it's not open source. Well, no surprises there. It's not open source, and it's not free software. Please don't use those terms where it's not applicable. Somebody even opened an issue on their GitHub repository. I doubt that you can see this over the stream, so I'll read the highlight bit. I will read a highlighted bit. Default has, since today, referred to itself as open source. This is incorrect. As per the OSI's definition of open source software, the software is not open source due to the clause disallowing commercialization of a game engine product. The OSI's OSD definition is widely accepted by all the software industry. This includes companies like Microsoft who use the term source available for software that has a source code available but disallows certain uses that the OSD requires, and so on and so forth. There was a lot of outrage as well. I've left out some of the more painful to read comments, but you can find them in the usual places. And it led me to wonder, like, why do we as a community get so upset when people use the word open source in a way that doesn't refer to one of these licenses? So there are two definitions of open source at play here. And I think it's really worth investigating the distinction between these two definitions and recognizing that there are two definitions. The first is the de facto definition provided by the open source initiative as reflected in the open source definition, which we'll get to in a moment. And this definition is designed to reflect business needs around open source. But there's also a colloquial usage, an everyday usage, a common usage. And this usage reflects the community practice. So we can define open source in two ways, or we do define open source in two ways. We define it, one, in terms of the licenses that open source software uses, and two, we define it as a referent to the actual practice of doing open source. And I think this distinction is very important because the very concept of open source, as we understand it now, came about as a reflection on community practices. Linux kernel development was considered radical at the time that it began because it was community focused, it was collaborative, it was open to participation. And nobody had really done that before, certainly not at that scale. And that was a turning point in the early 1990s when people saw that software could be developed in this way. And that right there is the seed of what we understand as open source. So why should we care about this distinction and these definitions? And the reason is that open source projects thrive when the people working on them thrive. And the way that we define open source shapes the way we run our open source programs and the kind of community that we build. If we want a thriving open source program, if we want a thriving open source community, we need to understand what we mean when we say open source. So when we're building an open source program, and this is going to be a demonstration of the way that we think of open source and how it affects our program building. When we think of starting an open source program, many of us often think about the GitHub checklist, which is available online. I'll have links to all of my references at the end of the talk, so you can see them. But this is a very commonly used checklist, license file with an open source license, basic documentation, easy to remember name. You've cleared the issue queue and so on and so forth. But what's really interesting is this thing. It's the very first thing that they want you to do when thinking about open source is that you need to select a license. Why though? Why is this the most important thing? I thought we were out there looking to build a community. What is the importance of selecting a license? Well, I've mentioned this name before. The Open Source Initiative is an organization that sought to protect and preserve the notion of open source. So the founders of this organization observed what was happening with the Linux kernel. They thought this was a good thing, but they also saw that it scared away business. They saw that there's a lot of risk involved in businesses participating in and adopting open source software. So the Open Source Initiative's primary goal from the days of its founding was to make business happy. And they wanted to make business happy by removing the risk of using open source software. And the primary tool that is used for removing risk, as I mentioned before, is the business contract. Business contracts spell out the rights and obligations of all the parties to the contract, and they spell out what happens when those obligations are not met, so that every party has a very clear idea of all the possible paths forward in that business transaction and what happens when things go wrong. And a software license is no different. A software license removes the risk in using or participating in a software project, right? And the OSI saw that licensing could be used to make open source more appealing to businesses in virtue of their risk removing factors. And so they created what we know as the open source definition. And the open source definition has 10 points to it. Unrestricted redistribution, that is to say that license holders can't stop distribution of software produced under an OSD license. The source code is included. Derived works are permitted, that is to say you can take the code and modify it. The integrity of the author's source code must be maintained. So you want the good historical record of what's been created and attribution where appropriate. No discrimination against persons or groups, and no discrimination against fields of endeavor. These are meant to capture the idea that the software should be free for everybody to use. It should be available without restriction for anybody. There must be a distribution of license. The license must not be specific to a product, must not restrict other software, must be technology neutral. I'm not going to dig too much into these things, except to note that all 10 points here are focused on the properties of licenses that open source software can have. There's nothing in here that is designed to capture community practices or that collaborative nature, that open participatory nature. All of this is designed to capture a set of requirements for business contracts that ensure that sufficient risk is removed, that open source is palatable to other businesses. Needless to say, this is a very narrow view of what open source is, hence the title of my talk. Open source is more than a license. Open source is far more than a license, right? So if the OSD isn't really meant to capture practice at all, like, why do we defer to the OSD as the definitive definition of what open source is? Why couldn't Defold call their software open source? So let's talk about the definition as collaboration, the usage of open source in practice. Nobody's really bothered to write this down. There's no formal definition that you can find anywhere. But we can intuit what this definition looks like. Open source is collaborative, right? It's not, excuse me, it's not really open if there aren't other people working on it outside of your team. It's just a closed source piece of software that you've made the source code available to. The idea is other people should be able to work together on that software. Likewise, it's open to participation. You don't specify who's permitted to work on it, but you're open to the idea that anybody could walk up and participate in it. And it's community driven in that the community of software users, the community of software collaborators and maintainers decide what the roadmap for that software looks like, what the next steps are, and how that software is built. It's not driven from a top-down fashion from one owner that tells everybody else what to do. Rather, it's from the bottom up, where the people participating in it make the decisions. And it uses whatever license best serves these purposes. When the Linux kernel development was started, they didn't pick a free software license. They picked an entirely different license. And this is rather controversial at the time, but the license choice was made for purely practical reasons, because it encouraged these sorts of attributes for the software development, that it was collaborative, that it was open to participation, that it was community driven. The license choice there was not made with an eye to what will make businesses happy, because it didn't make business happy at first. In fact, the OSI had to step in and clarify things to the point where businesses were happy to use Linux. So as community builders and as people who are building open source programs, we should really be interested in open source as defined by practice. And I think that one of the best ways to capture in a more concrete form a set of requirements for what open source as a community practice looks like can be found in the ethical source definition. The ethical source definition is a product of the ethical source working group, where we're very interested in understanding what building software for the good of humankind looks like. And so we have a number of points that we've put together that we believe reflect best practices for what we're calling ethical source software, but for our purposes, it also makes for really solid open source communities. So the first idea is that the software we build should benefit the commons. This one isn't so obvious, but I think we've all seen the case of corporate released open source software that's essentially thrown over the fence, and then nobody uses it. Nobody comes to participate in it. And the reason is there's no benefit for other people to use or participate in the software. It's merely a marketing or PR move on the part of the company to say, yeah, oh yes, we do open source. Of course we do. Look at this project, behold. But that's not really open source. It may have an open source project. But if there's no benefit to the community, if there's no benefit to the commons, there can't be a community in the first place because there's no reason for anybody to come to the project in the first place. It must be created in the open. The decision making must be transparent, and it must be participatory by the members of the community. If it's not created in the open, if it's simply created in the dark and then thrown over the fence, then it doesn't really matter how much it benefits the commons. If the community can't participate in the decision-making process, if they can't participate in the creation process, then there's a very thin basis for a community there in the first place. It must offer a welcoming and just community. This is also important. If you don't have a welcoming community, then even if people see benefit in the software, and even if the process is ostensibly in the open, nobody's going to show up. We need to take steps to ensure that new community members are onboarded properly, are made to feel welcome, and are not subject to the toxic behaviors of other community members through moderation and through codes of conduct that are carefully enforced. This way, we can build a community that is strong and sustainable and is thriving and isn't just there for transactional purposes, but is actually there for the community itself. You need to put accessibility first. And this one's a little surprising. You might not think accessibility is very important for your software, and you might not see the connection between making accessibility a priority and building a thriving community. But when you take issues like accessibility seriously, it serves as a signal to your potential community that you have a set of values that are aligned with creating good in other places, that you're not just building things out of self-interest and throwing them over the fence. And it's a powerful signal, and it will help you attract community members that are that are certainly interested in accessibility, but also community members that understand that accessibility is an important trait for the end user of the software. And that's going to help you build a much stronger community, a much more thriving community. Likewise, with prioritizing user safety. Not all software is such that it's very dangerous to the end users, right? But a lot of the software that we build can be very dangerous to the end users, especially when we're talking about, for example, machine learning, facial recognition technologies, for example. But there are any number of technologies out there that do pose a risk. And eliminating that risk is impossible, of course. But again, when you signal that the user safety is important to you, it indicates to your potential community that these are values that you have, and it's going to serve as a powerful beacon to potential community members that this is a good community to be a part of. Protecting user privacy also falls into the same kind of bin. Frequently, when we're building startups, the idea of user privacy, at least in Europe and the United States, falls by the wayside. With the result being an increased amount of legislation being passed demanding that user privacy be taken seriously, especially in Europe. When you build these sorts of protections into the software as a matter of a top priority, not only does this signal to your potential community that this is, again, a value that you have and that you take important, it builds trust with the community that you're not just exploiting them either. And that's an important thing when we're trying to add value to a community, that they not feel exploited. So that's the last item: encourage fair compensation. We all know that exploitative and extractive communities are unhealthy, unsustainable, and very difficult to grow. Um, so part of providing that value back to that community is is paying them. If you have a community member, if you have an open source contributor who is more than carrying their weight, hire them. Right. That's part of why we do open source in the first place. Of course, is to build hiring pipelines for our engineering team. Don't hesitate or contract with them, even if hiring them is not possible. Um, because otherwise you risk burning out. Otherwise, you risk sending the signal that you don't value the contributions of your biggest community members, and that tells people who aspire to be um, um, a bigger part of the community that maybe they should take their energy elsewhere. Fair compensation is an extremely important part of building a sustainable open source community. Well, you do these things, and so what? Well, you increase the diversity of your open source community. Recent reports show that the open source community is almost entirely white men, 95% men, and I forget the percentage of racial majorities that participate in open source, but it's not, there are a large number of underrepresented communities here. And having those diverse viewpoints is extremely important in building software that's going to be good for the end user, that's going to be good for the people contributing to it. And these steps that I outlined are going to be important and necessary for ensuring that you're having the most diverse possible community. The contributors that are attracted to your project have genuine passion and drive. We all know open source projects where people drop off a bug report, usually very angry, and then demand that change be made, or they drop off a PR without really understanding how that PR fits into the bigger picture or the roadmap. We want contributors to have an investment in the project. They stay around longer, they produce better code, they help mentor others who are new to the project. They become very valuable members of the community. And by following these steps that I suggested, we have a much larger chance of identifying those kinds of developers and building that passion and drive with them. As a result, they're more likely to take ownership. Running an open source program is time consuming, painful, and tedious. Having outside help from people who really know the software and really know the community is very important. And it's nice to not only have the chance to be able to hand a project over to highly invested community members, but again, maybe these could be people that you can hire onto your team to manage this full time. It ensures organic community growth, right? So we can advertise as much as we like that we have this open source project. And gee, wouldn't it be nice if you came and contributed to it? But we all know that's not really going to be an effective way to grow a community. The best way to grow a community is through word of mouth, through positive referrals from existing community members. And when you have a community that is consistently having good experiences and feeling very invested in the community, they're going to tell their friends about it, and they're going to tell their friends in very convincing ways. And it's going to be hands down the best way to ensure the organic growth of your community. Finally, you'll be genuinely working to make the world a better place. We love this phrase in startups, especially in America, that we're part of a startup because it makes the world a better place. And frequently, that's just a lie we tell ourselves to wake up in the morning and go to work. But we can do that. That actually is a thing we can do. And thinking about open source in terms of community is a way to do precisely that. So if there's one takeaway I want you to have from this talk, it's put your community first. Licenses are important, it's true, but they're not they're not the core of open source. They don't define open source. They're not the most important thing in open source. In fact, they're probably the least important thing in open source. Case in point, Epic Games has the Unreal Engine, which many of their community refer to as open source. It does not have an OSI approved license, but it has a fantastic community of game developers who use that engine to build really, really cool things to help each other and support each other, and it's thriving. And so, as far as I'm concerned, that's open source. Instead, reach for the tools that are going to make your community amazing. Licenses are not one of those tools. I've tried to offer you several tools that you can use to make amazing communities, and there are definitely other ways to do it as well. I'll have some links at the end of the talk to other content that people have provided on building amazing communities in open source. There's so many things that you can do that are not licenses. So I appreciate your time today. That QR code will take you to the site with all the links. It should be up. If it's not, I'll make sure that it is very soon. There's lots of further reading there on the topic as well. And I hope that you'll be thinking about your open source programs in a more community-oriented and less license-oriented way. Thank you.
Hi, Don. Thank you so much for the talk.
Thank you, Jordan. This has been a great opportunity. Thank you.
Appreciate it. I mean, I do have one question. So obviously, you've had many years of experience in Silicon Valley, working for, companies like GitHub, Slack. Now you're very much focused on, open source. And, this is something I'm not sure if you got a chance to analyze. Do you see a difference in the way open source is approached, or the practices in between the Asia region or the West, like the way people see it, the way they perceive it, the value of it? Do you see this sort of differences, or is it more defined by the company who's behind open source that more defines that, or do you see the culture and the regional difference kind of play a factor here?
I think it's extremely idiomatic. So just to be clear, I have very little insight into open source in the Asian communities. I tried while at Slack to understand there's very clearly a growing community of people building tools around Slack in Japan while I was with Slack, but it was almost impossible to reach out to those communities because those conversations were taking place, for example, on what is it called? Line? Path?
Yeah.
Path. Which you can't sign up for in America. Right.
Oh.
So it required a Japanese phone number and a Japanese address to create an account there. And so what could we do? There's no way to participate in those conversations. Never mind the lack of language skills on our team, which was something that we did eventually address. But even within just Silicon Valley, right? One very small, very idiomatic place, you see a lot of variation in the way that different businesses approach open source software and open sourcing their tools. Stripe is a really good example of a company that has built a really solid open source program inside of their company, at least judging from the outside. Right, it looks like they've really put in a lot of effort, especially around documentation and helping people get up to speed with their software. I'm trying to think of another contrast case with that. It's hard to think of them because so many companies, it feels like, do it poorly, where they just throw it over the fence. But I'd be really interested in investigating that question, actually, and the cultural differences between the West and with Asia, and how we approach open source software and producing and managing it.
Sure, got it. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think this is definitely an area I guess I had in mind when I was listening to your talk. And yeah, look forward to chatting more. Appreciate so much your time. Thank you, Don.
Thank you, Jordan.